Next, with President Biden leaving the race and former President Trump narrowly surviving an assassination attempt, the role of vice president is receiving more attention than usual. In light of this, we speak with presidential historian Jane Hampton Cook about the role of vice president and presidential running mate. Thank you so much for joining us, Jane. What does this election cycle prove about the importance of running mates and vice presidents?
Well, I think, for a long time, we really haven't focused much on the vice president in terms of, we haven't seen assassination attempts. We haven't seen a president resign or withdraw from a race before. So this year, we've seen the importance of the vice president take center stage when it comes to this presidential election, both between, President Trump's assassination attempt and then, of course, President Biden's decision to withdraw as a candidate.
Now, you said that Vice President Kamala Harris is taking President Biden's mantle in this race could be an example of indirect democracy. What does that mean?
Well, direct democracy is, the voters on the Democratic side went to the polls, they voted for President Biden, and they knew in the back of their mind that it was possible that Vice President Harris could become the nominee. I mean, that's always a possibility. And so now those delegates at the convention are representing the people, and they're changing their vote to Kamala Harris. So it's indirect. It's not a direct nomination for her. It's an indirect. She's on the same team. She was part of the equation, but she wasn't front and center back during the primary.
Talk about how important a presidential candidate's choice of running mate is.
It varies from cycle to cycle. Sometimes a president has chosen someone for geographical reasons to bring, a geographical region to their side when maybe they have a weakness. Sometimes, like President George W. Bush, he didn't want a vice president who was going to run for office as president. He wanted someone he could govern with without that pressure on the vice president. So that's why he chose Dick Cheney as his running mate, because Vice President Cheney really had no interest in running for president. And so it varies from, season to season, depending on kind of what the issues are and what's important to the president. And I think for President Trump, he chose J.D. Vance, a young senator, 39 years old, because he wanted his movement to carry on. And J.D. Vance represents the intellectual center of the populist movement that President Trump represents.
And what are some of the more notable in U.S. history, the most notable moments where the importance of vice president and running mates was made evident?
Well, back in the very beginning, the vice president was the person who came in second in the Electoral College. And so George Washington was first, John Adams was second. John Adams became vice president. But when John Adams became president, his rival in a new party, Thomas Jefferson, became vice president, and it just didn't work. They weren't ideologically on the same page about foreign policy. And so it was those struggles in our early days that led to the 12th Amendment that made it so that presidents and vice presidents ran together as a team and not just who placed second.
And Jane, who would you say is the most notable or consequential vice president in U.S. history?
Well, that's really hard to say. I would say, though, that Teddy Roosevelt was a very larger-than-life personality. His daughter said that he was the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Gravity, people who were just gravitationally pulled to him. He was vice president. President McKinley was killed in an assassination. And then Roosevelt ran for president on his own. And he really was this gravitational force. And we now have Teddy Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore. So he's probably the most consequential if you look at all of American history.
Okay, that's a pretty funny quote. Explain the American founders' original vision for the role of vice president, the process of selecting it, and how and why it changed. You've touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, so in the beginning, we didn't have political parties. In fact, George Washington did not want political parties. And they really wanted Americans to be united. And they had this sort of gentlemanly view of, okay, well, whoever places first becomes president, and whoever is second gets the second number of votes would be vice president. And you can see how that wouldn't work right today with the two political parties. You couldn't have, President Trump being president and then Kamala Harris being vice president. if the outcome, went that direction in the fall. And so we ended up having this mostly two-party system. Sometimes we've had four parties, sometimes we've had three. We've seen that effect. We saw that affect Abraham Lincoln's race. He became president because the Democrats were divided among three candidates, and he was the only Republican. And so, we've seen in our history, changes, but by and large, we've really had this two-party system since, the mid 1790s.
And Jane, just in closing here, Kamala Harris is expected to pick her running mate on Monday. From your view as somebody with extensive knowledge of presidential history, what would you say is the most important thing to consider when picking a running mate?
I do think you need to pick someone that you think you can govern with, someone that you can give incredible responsibility to, someone who could become president. I do think that should be the first priority. But, in Vice President Kamala Harris's position right now, she might want to choose someone like Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is a must-win state, and he represents the Rust Belt. And of course, J.D. Vance also represents the Rust Belt. So we'll see what happens. Sometimes, though, the Democrats like identity politics, and they might choose someone for identity reasons, to have maybe a historic, symbolic ticket that way. So we'll just have to see what she does, and I will know pretty soon.
All right. Presidential historian Jane Hampton Cook, thank you for your insightful perspective on this.
Thanks for having me.